You're loaded heavy and climbing. The main box is in its top gear, and there's nothing left to pull. The engine starts to lug, so your hand leaves the shifter, and instead of grabbing another gear, you flick a small switch on the knob. The truck drops into a lower gear without the stick ever moving. There's a second transmission on this truck. It isn't in the cab. It's hidden inside the rear axle. The way the old hands worked it was a skill almost nobody on the road today would recognize. For most of the last century, that switch was one of the most common things in American trucking and one of the least understood. Everybody knows a truck has a transmission. This kind of truck had two. There was the main gearbox up front, behind the engine, worked by the tall stick every driver knows. And then there was a second one, a smaller set of gears, hidden back inside the rear axle, worked by nothing but a little switch on the shift knob. Most people looking into the cab would never know it was there. There was only one stick. But that truck had twice the gears anyone could see. That second gearbox has a name that undersells it completely. The two-speed rear axle. It sounds like a small thing, a minor convenience. It was closer to the opposite. For 50 years, it was the piece of the driveline that led a plain work truck haul like something twice its size. And the men who ran it right were doing something with their hands and their timing that almost nobody on the road today could reproduce. So let's take it apart. Why a truck ever needed two gearboxes, how the old hands actually used the thing, and why it slowly disappeared without most people ever noticing it was gone. Start with the problem, because the problem is the whole reason it existed. A diesel engine, especially an old one, only makes its power across a narrow band of engine speed. Too low and it lugs and dies. Too high and it screams and wastes fuel and gets you nowhere. The driver's whole job on every hill and every stretch of road is to keep the engine inside that narrow band. And the only tool for that job is gears. The more gears you have, the more finely you can hold the engine right where it makes its power, no matter the load or the grade. But there's a catch, and it shows up the moment you add weight. A main transmission back then usually gave you 4 gears or 5. On flat ground, running empty, that was plenty. But load that same truck to the ceiling and point it up a mountain, and 4 gears is nowhere near enough. The jumps between them are too big. You grab a gear and the engine's lugging. You grab the next one down and now it's screaming and you've barely slowed the drop. There's a hole between every pair of gears, and on a hard pull, that hole is exactly where a loaded truck loses the fight. The obvious fix would be to build a transmission with more gears. But more gears means a bigger, heavier, more expensive gearbox, and there's only so much room behind the engine, and only so much a driver can row through by hand. So somebody had a better idea. Instead of cramming more gears into the box up front, put a second, smaller set of gears at the very back of the truck, right where the power finally reaches the wheels. Give that rear end 2 settings instead of 1, a high and a low. And here's the part people get wrong to this day. They hear 2-speed axle, and they picture a granny gear, 1 extra deep low gear for crawling. That is not what it was. It was a high range and a low range built into the differential itself, and it applied to every single gear in the main box. Flip it to low, and all of your gears got shorter and stronger. Flip it to high, and all of them got taller and faster. You didn't add 1 gear, you doubled the ones you already had. A 4-speed truck suddenly had 8 speeds. A 5-speed had 10. The old hands didn't call them 10-speed trucks, they called them a 5 and a 2 or a 4 and a 2. The first number was the stick. The second number was the axle. Now, how do you shift a gearbox that's 10 feet behind you, buried in the rear end, with one hand on the wheel and one on the shifter? You don't reach it. You flip a switch, and you let the truck do it for you. On most of these trucks that switch sat right on the shift knob, under your thumb or your fingers. Flick it toward low or toward high, and nothing happened yet. That's the trick almost nobody outside the cab ever understood. The axle would not shift while it was under load, while the engine was pulling hard through the driveline. It waited. The actual change only happened in the instant you lifted your foot off the throttle or pushed in the clutch, and the pressure came off the gears for a split second. In that tiny window, a spring inside the shift unit snapped the axle into its new range, and you fed the power back in, already sitting in a different gear. Early on, some of these were worked by engine vacuum. By the early 1950s, most had moved to a small electric shift unit, a little motor bolted onto the axle that wound up a spring and then waited for you to lift so it could finish the shift. Heavier trucks sometimes used compressed air to do the same job. Eaton built so many of them that for a whole generation of drivers, an Eaton two-speed axle was simply what you called the thing, no matter who actually made it. So picture what that hands a driver. You're not just picking one of 5 gears anymore. Between every gear on the stick, there is now a second choice hiding under your thumb. And the very best drivers didn't just use the axle to go from all low to all high once at the bottom of a hill. They used it in the gaps. They used it to reach into that hole between 2 main gears and pull out a ratio the transmission alone could never give them. That move, splitting the gears with the axle on the fly, is where the 2-speed stopped being a convenience and became a craft. And that is where we're going next. The move was called splitting the gears, and doing it well was closer to playing an instrument than driving a truck. Remember that hole between 2 main gears, the one where a loaded truck lugs in one and over-revs in the next. The 2-speed axle let a driver reach right into that hole. Picture him climbing, the engine starting to fall, running out of pull. Instead of yanking the stick down a full gear and sending the engine screaming, he flicks the axle into its low range, lifts off the throttle for a single beat, and the rear end drops a half step. Now he's in a gear that sits between the 2 on the stick, lower than where he was, but not the big cliff of a full downshift. The engine catches, settles right back into the fat of its power, and keeps climbing. He just pulled a gear out of thin air that the transmission by itself never had. And the great ones didn't do it once. They did it on every shift, the whole way up a grade. Stick, then axle, stick, then axle, splitting each gear in half so the engine never once fell out of its narrow band, flowing up a mountain in a dozen little steps instead of 4 big lurches. Both hands moving, one on the wheel and one on the stick, a thumb working the switch, an ear reading the engine, a foot timing every lift. No computer anywhere in it, just a man matching engine speed by sound and feel over and over, mile after mile. Get the rhythm right and a loaded truck climbs steady and clean, never bogging and never screaming. Get it wrong, and the price is immediate. This is the part that made the 2-speed axle respected and a little feared at the same time, because that axle would not always give you what you asked for. Ask it to shift at the wrong moment, catch it with the power still on, or ask it on a truck with a tired shift motor or a weak battery, and it wouldn't drop cleanly into the new range. It would hang up in between. Neutral. Not neutral in the transmission where you'd expect it, but neutral out in the rear end where there's nothing you can do about it. The engine revs, the stick is in gear, and not one bit of it reaches the wheels. Every old hand has a story about reaching for that half step on a steep grade and getting nothing back. The truck going quiet and starting to roll backward with the whole load shoving from behind. On a 7% grade with traffic stacked under you, that is a very long second. There was a hard logic to where they hit it, though. Multiplying the torque way out back at the axle after the drive shaft instead of up front meant that when something finally let go under a heavy pull, it usually twisted off a single axle shaft at one wheel. Bad, but something you could limp in from or fix on the shoulder. Do that same multiplying up front ahead of the drive shaft, and you could wring the whole drive shaft in two right down the middle of the truck. So the two-speed axle took its punishment in the cheapest place to fix it. That was the deal. A device that could leave you sitting in neutral on a hill, but one that usually broke at the wheel instead of the spine of the truck. So if it was this useful, why don't you see that little switch on new trucks or hear drivers bragging about their 5 and a 2 anymore? Because it didn't lose. It got swallowed, the way a lot of great old ideas do. Through the 1960s and 70s, transmission makers, Eaton chief among them, started building those extra ratios directly into the main gearbox. The Road Ranger 13-speed and 18-speed you find in trucks today aren't just big transmissions. Look at how they're put together. An 18-speed is a 9-speed main box with a 2-speed range section bolted on behind it, plus a splitter. That range section does the exact job the 2-speed axle used to do. It takes all your gears and doubles them, a high and a low. And it's worked the exact same way. You pre-select it, then you break the power for a beat and let it change because, just like the old axle, it will not shift while it's loaded. Truckers who came up running a 2-speed axle will tell you straight out that the first time they drove a range shift transmission, they already knew how, because it was the same move their thumb had made 10,000 times out on the axle. The splitter, the button that grabs those in between gears, sits right there on top of the shift knob, under the same thumb, doing the same thing the axle switch did. The gear between the gears is still there. It just moved from the rear end into the transmission and from a switch out of sight into a button in your hand. So the 2-speed rear axle didn't die. Its job got promoted. Every driver splitting an 18-speed on a grade today, hunting that half step to keep the engine happy, is running the 2-speed axle's trick without ever knowing its name. The device is mostly gone. The skill it demanded lives on, right under a thumb. And that skill was real. It took years to master. It separated the drivers who could from the drivers who couldn't. And for the men who ran a 5 and a 2 up a mountain in the rain, in the dark, by ear alone, it was a quiet kind of pride nobody could ever take away from them. So I'll ask you this, did you run a 2-speed axle? What was your combination, a 4 and a 2, a 5 and a 2, something bigger? And do you remember the first time you split it clean on a grade, or the first time it hung up in neutral and scared the life out of you? Tell the story in the comments. There are fewer people every year who can, and it's worth writing down. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above.